Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to the Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Yencha for his detailed briefing on the situation in Gaza and the situation with the hostages who remain in the enclave. We note the presence amongst us of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, Gideon Saar. We listened very carefully to Ella David, and we studied very carefully to the letter by the Israeli side, and we mourn for all the innocent victims of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, regardless of their citizenship and nationality. As all of those present here, we also were shocked by the footage earlier this month showing two Israeli hostages, Ron Braslavsky and Aviator David. In the video, they looked depressed, severely emaciated, and weakened because of an acute shortage of food and water, which, as we know, is something that all people in Gaza encounter. Every day spent by the hostages in Gaza is a tragedy for themselves, for their families, who spend every minute of their time waiting for their return. We also listened very carefully to the recent statements made by the relatives of Ron Braslavsky, Aviator David, and other Israelis held in Gaza. And we share their pain, but we cannot overlook the fact that the people who are in such a terrible emotional state and who fear for their children also voice a direct criticism of the leadership of the country, which, according to some of them, is drawing out the negotiating process with Hamas and thereby is assigning a death warrant for the remaining hostages. Let me recall here that we immediately condemn the tragic events of the 7th of October 2023. There can be no justification for that, nor can there be a justification for the collective punishment of the people in Gaza and turning a whole region into a zone of total despair. We advocated and continue advocating an immediate and unconditional release of all detainees and an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Mr. President, we are sincerely convinced that there is no delegation in this room which would dispute the very simple fact that the life of any person is important and priceless, and we shouldn't have to decide whose suffering is more worthy of attention. This applies equally to the Israelis in captivity and to the peaceful Palestinians who, for now 670 days, have been essentially suffering the bombardment by Israel. At the time when the whole world will watch the terrible footage of Rom Braslavsky and Viator David with horror, from Gaza, we received shocking data about the fact that since the 1st to the 2nd of August, 180 people died there. Such tragedies is something that we receive information about essentially daily. Since October 2023, more than 61,000 Palestinians have died, and amongst them, according to UNICEF, 18,000 are children. Against this background, the general situation in Gaza can only be characterized as a humanitarian catastrophe. And this has consequences not just for the Gazans, but also for the Israeli hostages. Palestinians themselves are dying in the enclave not only as a result of air bombs or artillery shelling, but also because of widespread hunger and disease outbreaks. According to the World Food Programme, every third Palestinian is going hungry for several days in a row. The grim statistics of the victims of hostilities and the lack of hunger is compounded by the dead and wounded as they line up for food rations at the sites of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And there the numbers of victims is in the thousands. Since 27th of May, almost 1,500 Palestinians were killed. We're seriously worried also by the consequences of the practice that was resumed since the end of July, the practice of airdropping of food supplies. As recently as yesterday, the humanitarian bombs crushed to death two medical workers from the Al-Aqsa hospital in Deir el-Balah. The Commissioner General of UNRWA, Mr. Lazzarini, in his recent comments warned against using such dangerous and costly way of supplying assistance. It's 100 times more expensive than using the land routes. Meanwhile, on the perimeter of this strip, there are 6,000 trucks with sufficient food supplies which would provide enough food to provide for several months for civilians. Mr. President, we are shocked by the targeted attack by IDF on the headquarters of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society in Han Yunis, as a result of which one staff died and several people were injured. Unfortunately, this is not the first time when members of the Red Crescent Society in Gaza died. We recall how the Israeli military mercilessly shot the ambulance Red Crescent, and their bodies were found in a mass grave subsequently. We call on Israel to stop this lawlessness. Humanitarians and medical workers should not be targeted, nor should the headquarters of the Red Crescent be targeted. It's clearly marked with its logo and unambiguously is under the protection of international humanitarian law. Contrary to the statement by West Jerusalem, the humanitarian blockade that they initiated in March essentially remains to date. What was announced on the 27th of July, namely partial easements and limited deliveries within the framework of the so-called tactical pauses, according to the UN humanitarians, is just a drop in the ocean compared to the acute needs of the Gazans, including, as we all understand, the needs of the Israeli hostages. In this context, we fully support the calls by the leadership of UNRWA and other specialized UN agencies to immediately remove the impediments to supplying into Gaza all of the essential things, including food, water, fuel, and medicines. We're very concerned by the aggressive campaign deployed by West Jerusalem against the staff of UN OCHA and its head, Tom Fletcher, who provide a sober and uncomfortable for Israel sometimes assessments of humanitarian situation. We can see that humanitarians are trying to analyze it comprehensively and find some ways of easing the plight of Palestinian civilians. What is undeniable here is that in order to have an uninterrupted and unimpeded humanitarian supplies, the main thing that is needed is to create the necessary security conditions. Unfortunately, the regular calls for a ceasefire that we hear from the Secretary General and from the absolute majority of the international community remain without due reaction from Israeli leadership. West Jerusalem continues intending to continue with the war in Gaza using by any means and under any pretext, and tries to prevent the stoppage of a military operation in the sector. Mr. President, we are equally concerned also by the fact that the Israeli authorities decided to cleanse and colonize the West Bank of the Jordan River. The victims of continuous raids by security services and violence of settlements, the victims of that are the regular Palestinians and foreigners sometimes. For example, on the 30th of July, there was an attack against the office vehicle of the Russian representation with the Palestinian Authority. And this was done under the lenient eye of the Israeli military. Furthermore, there are new negative records being made of the destruction and seizure of the property of the local citizens, building new settlements, legalizing outposts to make sure that the Palestinian towns are not connected to each other. Knesset continues passing new provocative passages. Following yesterday's decision to ban UNRWA at the end of July, there was another dangerous decision made about extending Israeli sovereignty of the West Bank. It is clear the systematic expulsion of the Palestinians, be it from Gaza or the West Bank, is something that's fraught with new risks and dangers for the stability and security of the Middle East and can yet once again bring the region to the brink of a major war. It is also clear that the complete freedom of action that the Israelis have, freedom to do anything in Gaza or in the West Bank, would have been impossible without a direct military support and international and political cover provided by the United States. At the same time, the absolute majority of states in the world are rejecting this line. And what is telling in this situation was the Israeli and American boycott of the conference on the 28th, 30th of July, the high-level conference in support of this two-state solution, and the futile attempts by Washington to dissuade their partners from participating in this representative forum. We do have certain optimism from the fact that despite the pressure from the Americans, the majority of the international community remained unintimidated and showed solidarity with the Palestinian people. And some Western capitals, although belatedly, nonetheless announced their plans to recognize the state of Palestine next month. Mr. President, despite this fact that the situation is very difficult, we remain convinced that the diplomatic settlement of the conflict was and remains the only viable solution here. And we call on the parties with support of mediations to return to the negotiating table so as to work out mutually acceptable solutions so as to restore the ceasefire regime, release those who are detained, and unblock the humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip. And we are confident that this is what the people of Palestine want, as well as the families of hostages, including the relatives of Israelis held in Gaza. And we hope that all regional and international stakeholders will work towards this goal. The negotiation process must return to a political track, which will the kind that will accommodate both Israelis' legitimate security interests and the Palestinian people's hard-earned right to establish their own state within the 1967 borders. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative